if Israel and the U.S. are really dead set on this, and it just seems clear that no matter what, they failed, but they're just going to try again. They're just a broken record. Why doesn't Iran strike first if they know this is coming? I think they have enough evidence and global support, I think, on their side now.
Right.
After what we've been witnessing in Gaza for over 2 years, and just we did a sucker punch attack on them in the middle of negotiations.
Right.
So it's not like it's coming out of the blue.
Right.
It's recent enough in history that I think people would understand. Oh yeah, this was something's going on over here, and Iran should have the right to strike.
Right. Well, I think much of the world would understand. Of course, it would be played up as naked, unprovoked aggression in the West, and you'd be surprised. Again, I mean, I do make a point of reading mainstream news sources, and again, Haaretz and these other news sites, and they inhabit a completely different mental space, in which. Yeah, Israel is just a poor little victim, and the U.S., though we may have some issues with Trump, basically is a force for good that is trying to keep these, teach these brutal regimes a lesson. That's the world that they live in, and it will be described as unprovoked, brutal aggression, by the Iranians. Now, I guess if I were the leader of Iran, I would say, well, it doesn't matter. No matter what, they're going to paint us this way. So, maybe we just need to go ahead and do that. But Pezeshkian seems to be not the man to do it. In the end, it may not even be his decision. It may be that the supreme leader, if he actually insists on it, and with the IRGC supporting him, it could happen. I think Pezeshkian himself would be reluctant to. He's proved to be cautious, and again, really not, I think, the leader for a country in wartime.
Yeah, I think if Iran, the way to do it would be to adopt the moral position, to say to Israel, says, look, you need to pull out of Gaza. You need to stop this madness that we've all been seeing. You need to pull out of Lebanon. You need to stop the destruction of the West Bank. You need to pull out of Syria. And then if they say this, then the whole world will be like, yes, please, we don't want to see this suffering and bloodshed just stream to us on our phone constantly, and nobody does a damn thing about it.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, people are like, yes, please. And then this gives them the impetus, because we know that Israel won't do that. And then we can't just say that, it just came out of blue as a sneak attack, the way that they're going to paint it unprovoked. It's like Iran stated its stance. And it's the stance that the whole world wants to hear, to say, stop this madness, Israel. Stop slaughtering women and children in Gaza.
Yeah.
Stop taking land in the West Bank and in Syria and Lebanon, bombing countries constantly.
Right.
And I think people would get behind it. And then,
well, you may be right. And, maybe if Raisi was still the president there, maybe that's what they would be doing. But I just don't think Pezeshkian is the man to do it.
Do you think that was that helicopter that went down? Do you think that was just a mechanical failure? Or I don't know. I just don't. Everything I've seen Israel do, I just feel like.
Yeah. Well, I when it happened, and again, the Iranian government has reported that they have stated very clearly that it was a mechanical failure, and they haven't changed their position. I took that, explanation as the truth. I guess after Operation Rising Lion, I began to have second thoughts, because you saw the degree of penetration of Iranian society. And so it just said, well, if they could do that, they could have got to some mechanic or whatever, that worked on that helicopter. Now, I don't think they couldn't have had, I don't think, the foresight that okay, Raisi is gone, it's going to be Pezeshkian. But maybe they knew enough to say he's likely to be the replacement, and we think that he's going to be easier to deal with. So it could have happened. It really could have. I have to, helicopters sometimes do crash. There was a helicopter crash not too far from where we used to live. They do. These things do happen. Helicopters are actually, they're not like airplanes. When something goes wrong, they just drop like a rock, and maybe that's what happened. But I just have to be suspicious. Again, especially after Operation Rising Lion, I became very suspicious.
Yeah, well, and also we just know that the Israelis in the United States, they don't really think much beyond after they kill a leader. Their idea is just we do these decapitation strikes. I mean, look, we kidnapped Maduro, but we left the government in power. Israel killed Nasrallah, the Yemen leadership as well, Khania. That's their modus operandi is just keep on going after the top, and hopefully it sows chaos down below.
Yeah. Good point.
So I don't know if they really think like, oh, we'll get Pezeshkian in and he's better. It's just like, wow, we just love killing the leaders.
Yeah, and I think probably they also recognize that Raisi was a formidable opponent. Somebody who, that they to some extent respected. Because they feared him. They understood that he, would. That he unified Iran and would be certain to provide forceful responses.
Are you kind of surprised that there aren't any countries that are just clearly speaking up for the Palestinians? Because just seeing the rhetoric coming from Europe and the United States during the so-called, to protect these so-called protesters, which were really insurrectionists that were funded by the CIA and Mossad, everybody went along with it and said this is a justification for military intervention. But meanwhile, we've just watched Gaza completely leveled. You just see the footage of it. These people don't have homes to live in. They have nothing, and they're being shot at and slaughtered every day.
Right.
And nobody in the world says anything. Even Iran isn't vocal about it. When they talk about
they do make statements. They don't get reported in our press. I mean, I think Iran has always been very, very clear about it, and it has been unequivocal in its support for the Palestinians and unequivocal in its condemnation of Zionism. That's one reason why the Israelis hate them so much. Now, a lot of people think that under Pezeshkian, they have failed to back up their words with action, that they should have provided more support to Hezbollah, for example, and maybe more support to the Houthis in Yemen. Again, that's another thing, a consequence of the loss of Raisi. But as far as the words go, I think they have always been unequivocal in, their stance pro-Palestine and anti-Zionism.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me because, I've heard other pundits, I think it was Mark Sloboda, which is saying, yeah, well, it's sorry to say, but the Gazans are just doomed. And that's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, yeah.
Just think that they're just doomed, that no one's going to come to help them. Because Trump is saying help is on the way for these insurgents. We're going to bomb this country, and no country can even like just economic sanctions. Just stop trade with Israel. Stop cut off ties. Like we were not saying there's no. I just don't understand how every country in the world other than Yemen really go Houthis. Nobody else is really doing anything. Everyone just kind of ignores it and says, it's a horrible thing. It really is. It's awful. We hate it. Bad Israel, bad United States.
Right. Well, again, there are a lot of countries that have taken strong stances, but they just haven't backed it up. And again, I think you really have to, if you're going to point your finger to any country, you need to point it to the neighboring countries like Turkey and Egypt and Jordan. First of all, they are the neighboring countries. And second, they are co-religionists. These are Sunni countries. They, above all, have a responsibility to deal with this. And we know that they haven't. Now, Turkey was really particularly in a position to do something. I think Jordan and Egypt are much weaker. But Turkey, could have cut off that oil. You can say, they had this contract and whatever, but these are exceptional circumstances. They could have and could have really cut off trade. They could have done things that really would have hurt Israel, and they just didn't. Under Erdogan, they didn't. And a lot of Turks are upset about that. So, I mean, if you're going to blame any countries, I think you got to point to those countries first and foremost. And then, we have this so-called peace plan in effect, that was actually approved by the Security Council. Why was it approved by the Security Council? Why didn't Russia and China cast dissenting votes. They both abstained. Russia proposed an alternative, which would have been much fairer, and really was based on international law, but they didn't get the support. And again, this is what the Russians themselves point out. They didn't get support from those neighboring countries, not just the ones that I mentioned, but also the Persian Gulf states and whatever. And you say, well, if you people yourselves won't do anything, how can you expect us to save them? I still wish they would. I mean, for example, China obviously has huge economic power. Again, they've been very, very clear, in their denunciations of Israel, but they haven't backed it up, and it's not the way Chinese do things, but I wish that they would in this case. This is so exceptional, and I think they would actually make China much more popular around the world. They did it.
Right. Yeah, it's something that I think I mentioned before, is that from what the U.S. and Israel have done over the past couple of years, and really if we go back further, just the moral capital of the United States has been extinguished. There is a moral vacuum in the world right now. And so it's an opportunity for these countries like China to step up and take a moral stance and say, no, this is wrong, and the world will be behind it. And that will do immense good for any country's soft power that takes that position. So to me, it makes sense to do it. And it also, we can potentially just avoid a catastrophic war and the use of a nuclear weapon if we sanction a country like Israel, if China does cut off trade, says no more rare earths, and doing it to the United States as well. I mean, it's funny because there's always these accusations being pointed towards China, saying how they're the ones keeping Russia in the fight, supplying all these components and all these things. When the reality is, China does this for everybody, including the United States. So China is really propping up. And Ukraine, right. Because China makes everything. So really, China has the biggest cards to play. And so they, ironically, are really propping up the U.S. empire, because the U.S. empire relies on China almost completely relies on it. I won't say how much, but I mean, we know, I think, was it like 50% of the components from the U.S. military actually come from China. So it's, and the rare earths, those are necessary for all of our high-end weapons manufacturing and high tech here. Those all come from China. They hold all the cards. They could bring it down without a war, or maybe that would trigger a war. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that may be the risk, but I agree with you. And I would even say with Russia, I kind of wonder, I'm not sure, but, we have a lot of criticism of Putin. He's so moderate. He's always kind of, again, trying to, almost pretend that he has a friendship with the United States, and that, when the reality is that the U.S. is attacking him every day, right? And maybe that's the right policy. Again, he's trying not to escalate. He knows he can win this war. He doesn't want it to expand. He doesn't want to provoke Trump. So he may be right about all that. But I can see the other side of it. It's just speak with clarity. And I think that, especially in this time where the U.S., there's this obvious moral collapse, as you were, just mentioned, in the U.S. and the West in general, certainly Europe as well. There's this obvious moral collapse. It's a chance for Russia and China really to seize the banner, of moral civilization and say, this is who we are, and we oppose this unequivocally. No, and in some senses they're doing it, but at the same time, they're kind of muddying the waters. I think they're proceeding maybe too cautiously. But again, we're talking about a potential for war. Maybe they have to do that. But they're the two countries that really can, because the thing is, when you talk about other countries, including Iran, or Venezuela, and we see what happened to Venezuela, because Venezuela was very, very open about its opposition to Western hegemony and its opposition to Zionism, and its ties with Russia and China. And you see what happened, right? And we see what Iran is being subjected to right now, right? So any country, a smaller country that goes really out on a limb, does, risk something. They say you'll be the next sanctioned country, and then, there's going to be a fleet off of your shore. And so a lot of countries, think twice. But Russia and China can. They're the two countries that really can do this and survive, and maybe, I'd argue thrive if they, maybe, I would hope would thrive. I know there's risk involved in taking this approach.
Yeah, well, I would just say, I think Yemen is the example for countries that they have shown that they could stand up to this power, and they are treated as heroes, rightly so.
But they've also been, they suffered a decapitation strike. Much of their leadership has been killed. A lot of facilities, hospitals, and so on have been destroyed. They have suffered the consequences.
True.
But again, they were so poor already that they didn't have all that much to lose, which is
they're already at
why
the bottom.
They did. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you just think about the moral standing of these countries like Yemen and Iran, 5 years ago, people would they would be, these are bad countries. Now, the majority of the world is like, these guys are the ones that are standing up. These are brave people, men and women that are fighting for, the right for resistance and the right to live, just fighting for these
sovereignty, and then, and opposing genocide. Right.
Right. Opposing genocide. That's why is it so hard to get everybody on board with this? It's really ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anything else we want to talk about regarding the Middle East? Well, one last thing. Are we moving? I saw something. We're moving to phase 2. Is that actually happening?
Yeah, that's one thing I wanted to mention. Trump, the Trump administration has announced that they're moving to phase 2, which would mean the establishment of an international stabilization force. It would also mean disarmament of Hamas. And it would mean withdrawal, from the yellow line. The Israelis would have to retreat farther. All of those things would happen. And I guess also the creation of what they call a Palestinian technocratic committee. That's sort of it would be a committee that oversees really the reconstruction of Gaza. So we're dealing with, you can say, technical humanitarian issues, what to do with the rubble, how to start the rebuilding, repair the desalination plants and the hospitals and everything that has been destroyed. And they have chosen somebody, I think a Palestinian living in Egypt, if I'm correct, to head this commission, but they haven't named the other people. And I think, they also meant there's some Bulgarian who's supposed to be the head of the peace board or something. Or he would be under Trump, but I think he would be the guy under Trump. But I think, he has a history of being very closely aligned with the Zionists. Now, that all sounds maybe encouraging. Maybe it is. But the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, has essentially kind of dismissed it and said, that's just symbolic. In other words, they have no intention of retreating. I don't think, they were fine with the first phase, again, getting the hostages back, above all, but they got to keep, more than half of the land, and they have actually been expanding that. They've been moving the yellow line, as they always do. They always play these games. Everything, we've mentioned all the violations. Well over 400, we're approaching 500 have been killed, about a third of them children. These happen every day. And they destroy homes too. They've been destroying thousands of homes on both sides of the yellow line. So they have, they got something out of the first phase. They didn't really keep their side of the bargain, except that they slowed down, they ended the ground offensive and they slowed down the bombing. So they're, instead of killing dozens a day, they're killing a few people every day. That's what's happening. But they don't want to go. They don't want to go to phase 2. They don't want to give up territory. They don't want to have an international force in Gaza because they want Gaza. The only part of it they like is the Hamas handing over its arms, and Hamas has actually said that they're willing to do that if Israel keeps its side of the bargain and actually does withdraw. It complies with all with its obligations. But the Israelis just won't. So I don't see it going anywhere. And again, essentially they waved it off. Netanyahu and his people. It's just symbolic. They're not going anywhere.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as always, it seems like this is just the temporary pause, and we're going to see what's going to happen next in the Middle East. I mean, with Iran, there's so many things with Gaza,
Right.
also Somaliland. There's something else cooking.
Yeah. Well, one
Israel
thing
won't
also,
stop.
yeah. Well, one thing I just wanted to mention because before we leave the Middle East, it was also reported that one of the reasons that Trump chose not to launch the attack, the other day, was that the Israelis actually requested for more time. They were afraid of what would happen to them. And so I think their idea is that, well, maybe they want the U.S. assets, and the reason partly to provide them defense. That's because remember, it wasn't just Israeli air defense, it was also U.S. air defense. Now, I think they're really, even together, they're insufficient, but they want as much air defense as they can possibly get. So apparently Netanyahu said, maybe we shouldn't do this now. They could hit us really hard and we can't do much about it.
Yeah, I saw some report. I don't know if it's true that Iran and Israel kind of communicated via Russia that they won't hit each other. That basically that this was the U.S. is doing this alone. That Israel's staying out
Yeah.
of it, even though.
Well, I think that's believable. That was something that I think I mentioned in the last episode, is that Israel, probably won't be directly involved in this. If it had happened yesterday, they would try to keep out of it because they don't want to be hit. And they say, oh, nothing to do with us. And, but clearly at the same time, we're getting these statements about Mossad and whatever. I think I don't think that they're hoping not to be hit, but maybe they did work something out like that with the Iranians. It's believable. These things do happen, even between the bitterest enemies.
That's so crazy then if Israel would get a stay out of it potentially, if that's what they made, and that the U.S. has to do it all. And why us? Because Israel told us to do it.
Right.
That's why.
No. It's just we're concerned about human rights and
right.
innocent protesters. That's why we do things.
Clearly.